She walked through the airport with a quiet confidence that turned heads without effort. She was not flashy or loud, but there was something in the way she carried herself that commanded respect. Her shoes clicked softly against the polished floor, and her bag swung gently from her shoulder. People moved aside politely as she passed, sensing her presence. She had just finished a long day at work, one of those days that left her mentally tired but satisfied, the kind that reminded her why she loved her job. She was used to challenges, to handling people who doubted her, to proving herself over and over, yet today felt different somehow, though she could not have said why. She approached the security line and patiently waited her turn. She had learned long ago that rushing never helped. Today her mind wandered to the meeting she had attended earlier, to the tough decisions she had made, and to the email that still needed her attention. She had no idea that a completely different kind of challenge was about to meet her, one that had nothing to do with paperwork or policy, but would test her composure in a very personal way. The security officer greeted her politely, asking her to place her bag on the scanner. She smiled and complied, moving her laptop, her phone, and her small folder into the bins. She lifted her arms for the scanner and passed through smoothly. No alarms, no fuss. It was a normal, uneventful process, and she appreciated that small, quiet victory. Once past security, she made her way to the boarding gate, scanning the screens to see if there were any delays. The flight was on time, thankfully. She found a seat near the window and set her bag down beside her. She reached for her tablet and began reading, losing herself in a mix of news articles and documents she had been meaning to review. Around her, the airport buzzed with life. Families argued quietly over lost boarding passes. Couples held hands and whispered. Children ran and squealed. In the midst of all that, she felt a strange sense of calm. Boarding began, and she joined the line with the same quiet confidence she had shown throughout the day. The gate agent checked her boarding pass and waved her through. She walked down the jet bridge and entered the plane. The flight attendants greeted her politely, smiling as they helped passengers find their seats. She settled into hers and placed her bag in the overhead compartment. The seat beside her was empty, thankfully. She adjusted her jacket, took a deep breath, and tried to relax. She had just started opening a new document on her tablet when she noticed movement in the cockpit area. The pilot was standing there checking papers and speaking briefly with a flight attendant. There was nothing unusual about that except that there was a tension in the air she could not ignore. Something about the pilot's posture, the slight tightening of his jaw, gave off an impatient, almost hostile energy. She shrugged it off, assuming she was imagining things. People projected their anxieties sometimes, especially before a flight. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, she noticed the pilot's eyes flick toward her seat. A cold flash of judgment crossed his expression, brief but unmistakable. She looked away politely, focusing on her tablet. She had learned that ignoring small provocations often worked best. Some people just needed a reminder that their assumptions were wrong, and she had spent her life quietly correcting those assumptions without causing a scene. A few minutes later, she heard the flight attendant call for clarification about a seating issue. The plane was nearly full, and there had been a mix-up with 2 seats near the middle of the cabin. She raised her hand politely and asked for help, explaining that she had been assigned a window seat, but it seemed someone else was already in it. Her voice was calm, firm, and clear. She did not demand or complain. She simply explained the situation as it was. The pilot, standing near the front of the plane, overheard her. At first she thought it might just be her imagination again, but then she saw the tightness in his shoulders and the slight scowl as he turned back to the cockpit. It was subtle, but she had seen it many times before in other situations where people assumed they could assert dominance because of skin color, gender, or both. He assumed she was just another passenger, someone insignificant, someone he could belittle if he wanted. She did not fit his assumptions, and that seemed to bother him more than he could hide. As the flight continued, she remained composed. She adjusted her seat, organized her notes, and occasionally glanced out the window. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the airport and the surrounding landscape. It was peaceful, almost serene if one ignored the tension in the cockpit. She could hear murmurs from other passengers, the quiet shuffle of bags, the soft hum of the engines preparing for takeoff. She focused on her breathing, keeping herself centered, reminding herself that she was in control of her own space, her own reactions. Then, it happened. She had been asked to clarify a minor point about safety procedures for the passengers in her row. She asked politely, wanting to make sure she understood correctly. That simple request seemed to trigger something in the pilot. His face hardened and he stepped closer, leaning slightly over the service area in a way that made his aggression clear. He spoke sharply, using words that were dismissive and mocking. She could hear the edge of condescension in his voice, the assumption that she was overstepping her place. She remained calm. She did not shout. She did not panic. She simply held eye contact, her tone steady and even as she asked him to clarify his instructions. The contrast between her composure and his aggression was palpable. Passengers began to notice the tension. Some shifted in their seats uncomfortably. A few whispered to each other, sensing that something was off. She knew what he assumed, and she knew the look of someone realizing, even subconsciously, that they were wrong about another person. She had seen it before in offices, in meetings, in public spaces. It was familiar. Without warning, he reached out and slapped her hand away from the armrest. It was a small motion, but deliberate, a demonstration of control meant to intimidate. The cabin went quiet. She felt the sting, but she did not flinch. Instead, she took a deep breath and looked around, making sure the flight attendants were aware. She said nothing, but her calm authority filled the space. Passengers were frozen between shock and uncertainty, unsure whether to speak up or wait. She quietly addressed the nearest flight attendant, speaking in a low, firm voice. She asked them to follow proper procedure and to document what had happened. She made it clear, without raising her voice, that she expected accountability. There was no anger in her tone, no melodrama, only calm expectation. That calm, collected presence made the situation feel heavier, more serious. The passengers were watching now, realizing that this was not a trivial matter. This was a confrontation that would demand attention. The flight attendant nodded, carefully noting the incident and maintaining professional composure. She glanced at the woman, sensing her quiet authority. There was no hesitation, no wavering. The woman's demeanor said it all. She was someone used to handling conflict, someone not easily intimidated, someone who would not allow unfair treatment to go unchecked. As the plane continued toward cruising altitude, the woman sat back and allowed herself a moment to process. She thought about how often she had faced moments like this in her life, times when assumptions had been made about her abilities, her authority, her worth. She had learned to navigate these moments with patience and clarity, to respond with intelligence rather than emotion. Today was no different, though the stakes felt immediate and personal. The passengers around her continued to murmur quietly, some exchanging concerned glances. A few tried to focus on their own devices, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. She could feel it too, but she remained anchored, calm in the eye of a storm that had nothing to do with weather. She reminded herself that she was in control of her reactions. The rest, she knew, would unfold naturally. By the time the plane leveled off, she had made a decision. She would not escalate unnecessarily, but she would ensure that the inappropriate behavior was addressed. She would let the crew know her expectations quietly but firmly. She would maintain dignity and composure, no matter the provocations. That was who she was. She had faced challenges before, often in far less controlled environments, and she had never let anyone diminish her presence. This situation, while unusual, was just another opportunity to demonstrate that strength. Passengers continued to steal glances at her, sensing her quiet authority. She did not notice them. She focused on her tablet, making notes and preparing for the day ahead. Yet the presence she carried, unspoken but undeniable, shifted the atmosphere in the cabin. The pilot, now aware that she would not be intimidated, seemed to hesitate in his movements, unsure of how to assert dominance without attracting attention. That hesitation was all she needed. The rest of the flight was calm, though the tension remained. She continued to review her documents, occasionally glancing up to ensure the pilot remained in check. She did not speak unnecessarily, but she was ready, mentally prepared for whatever would come next. The passengers could feel the quiet strength emanating from her, a silent message that this was not a confrontation that would be ignored or forgotten. By the time the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers began to move about the cabin, she had already formulated. The plane had reached a smooth altitude and passengers were starting to relax after the initial tension of takeoff. The hum of the engines was steady, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the flight attendants moved quietly up and down the aisles, attending to passengers. The woman remained calm, focused on her tablet, but she could not ignore the energy in the cabin. A subtle unease lingered, a quiet tension that made people shift in their seats or glance nervously at the front of the plane. It was as if everyone instinctively felt that something had happened that was not supposed to happen on a normal flight. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that control over her own reactions was paramount. She had faced difficult situations many times before. At work, in public, even in situations where people assumed they could dominate or belittle her because of who she was. But this was different. This was up close in a confined space with a man who was supposed to be professional and in charge. And yet, in that moment, he had overstepped every boundary of respect. The pilot, seemingly unaware of the silent authority she carried, remained tense and agitated in the cockpit. She could see him through the small window near the front of the cabin as he adjusted controls and spoke briefly with a co-pilot. His expression was tight, as if he could barely contain his irritation. The subtle scowl that had flickered across his face earlier was still there, now hardened, and she knew he was aware of her presence but had not yet fully processed the fact that she would not be intimidated. She returned her attention to her tablet, scrolling through documents and notes she had prepared for work the following day. But her mind was alert, scanning the environment, noting every movement, every gesture. She had learned long ago that being calm did not mean being unaware. It meant being prepared, being aware, and knowing exactly how to respond if necessary. And she knew that in this situation, preparation meant observing carefully, documenting quietly, and maintaining her composure above all else. A few rows ahead, a passenger coughed nervously. Another shuffled papers in their lap. The flight attendants continued their routine, offering drinks and snacks. She noted the subtle glances being exchanged toward the cockpit and toward her. People were sensing the friction, even if they could not see it directly. She did not mind. She had never relied on anyone else to assert her own authority. She could do that herself. And yet, the presence of witnesses made her feel a small reassurance that there were people who would notice if something inappropriate happened again. It was during the beverage service that the next incident occurred. She had politely asked for a cup of water from the flight attendant, and as she reached out to take it, the pilot leaned slightly over the service area. His tone was sharp, mocking, and dismissive. He made a remark about her being too concerned with small details, and his words carried an edge of contempt that made the entire row stiffen in surprise. He assumed she would shrink back, remain silent, and accept his condescension, but she did not. She looked directly at him, her gaze calm and unwavering. She spoke in a clear, steady voice, asking for clarification, making it obvious that she expected respect. The contrast between her calmness and his aggression was like oil and water. Passengers began to notice, some whispering quietly to their neighbors, sensing the tension escalating. She did not raise her voice. She did not show anger. She simply made it clear that she would not tolerate disrespect, even in such a confined, unusual space. The pilot's face darkened further. He seemed to struggle with the realization that his usual methods of asserting dominance were failing. His hands clenched briefly, then relaxed. He tried to regain a posture of control, but the subtle power dynamic had already shifted. She had quietly established her presence as someone who would not be intimidated, someone whose authority, though unspoken at this point, was undeniable. Then came the slap. It was sudden, a quick motion meant to startle and assert dominance. The pilot slapped her hand away from the armrest as if to say, "This is my space. I am in control here." The sound was soft but unmistakable, and for a moment the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Passengers froze, unsure how to react. Some looked at each other in shock. Others stared silently at the scene unfolding in front of them. The woman, however, remained calm. She felt the sting but did not flinch. She simply lifted her hand, adjusted her posture, and looked around to make sure the flight attendants had noticed. She addressed the nearest flight attendant quietly, her voice low but firm. She asked that the incident be documented and that proper procedures be followed. She did not yell. She did not create a scene. She did not need to. Her calm authority spoke volumes. The flight attendant nodded, carefully noting the details while maintaining professional composure. There was no need for drama. The presence of witnesses and the clarity of the situation were already enough to make the seriousness of the event clear. Passengers began to murmur quietly among themselves, exchanging glances that carried a mix of shock, confusion, and concern. A few tried to continue reading or focus on their devices, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was a tension in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that what had just happened was wrong and that someone was quietly standing up for themselves. It was a subtle, powerful moment. The woman took a deep breath, letting the moment pass without escalating it unnecessarily. She understood the value of patience and observation. She had handled confrontations before in environments far less contained than an airplane, and she knew that reacting impulsively would not serve her purpose. Her goal was not to shame the pilot immediately. Her goal was to ensure accountability, to make it impossible for him to dismiss what he had done, and to protect herself and others from further misconduct. She noticed the pilot shifting in his seat, no longer as confident or aggressive as before. He was aware now, even subconsciously, that he had underestimated her. That subtle recognition made her even more composed. She could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands fidgeted slightly as he tried to regain control. It was almost imperceptible, but she had learned to notice these small details. They told a story of someone realizing too late that they had miscalculated. The cabin remained quiet for several minutes, filled with the soft hum of the engines and the occasional shuffle of a passenger. She returned to her tablet, focusing on her work, but her mind remained alert. She continued to scan the environment, noting the reactions of the crew, the passengers, and the pilot. She knew that staying calm, composed, and professional would make any further aggression more difficult for him. His actions had already been witnessed, and that documentation mattered more than anything she could say in the moment. A passenger in the row ahead leaned slightly to whisper to the person next to them, asking if she was okay. She nodded politely, offering a small, reassuring smile. She appreciated their concern but did not want to draw unnecessary attention. Her focus remained on maintaining control of her space and ensuring that the situation did not escalate further. The quiet dignity she carried had a subtle effect on the cabin. People were beginning to sense that this was not a trivial matter, that this woman was someone whose presence demanded respect, and that any further misconduct would not go unnoticed. As the flight continued, the woman quietly documented the events on her phone. She recorded notes, timestamps, and details that would be important later. She did not record the pilot directly, not out of fear but out of strategy. She understood that keeping detailed factual notes would be far more effective if any formal investigation were required. Her calm, methodical approach contrasted sharply with the pilot's erratic, emotional behavior. She had learned long ago that facts, clarity, and composure carried far more weight than anger or shouting. The flight attendants occasionally glanced her way, sensing the authority she carried without needing to assert it loudly. They maintained their professionalism, attentive to the passengers and the unusual tension, while quietly acknowledging the woman's presence as someone capable and unshakable. Their respect, silent but present, reinforced her position in the cabin. She did not need allies to act. She simply appreciated the quiet acknowledgement that she was handling the situation as effectively as anyone could. Minutes passed, and the pilot's behavior began to shift subtly. He no longer attempted direct confrontation. His posture was tighter, his movements more measured. He seemed aware now that any aggressive act would not only fail, but also be documented and witnessed. The power dynamic had shifted completely, without a word being raised in anger, without any dramatic confrontation. The woman's calm, firm presence had done what intimidation never could. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude and passengers were allowed to move about the cabin, the woman had already decided on her next steps. She would not escalate unnecessarily, but she would ensure that the pilot's behavior was fully addressed at the appropriate moment. She would maintain her composure, her dignity, and her authority, allowing the consequences of his actions to unfold naturally. She understood the power of patience, clarity, and strategic observation. The passengers continued to steal glances at her, sensing her quiet strength. Some whispered softly to their neighbors, commenting on the unusual tension in the cabin and the woman's. The plane was flying steadily now, the hum of the engine steady and comforting. Passengers were settling in for the flight, some leaning back in their seats, others quietly scrolling on their devices. Despite the calm exterior, the woman remained alert. She had faced challenges before, but this situation required more than patience. It required observation, strategy, and quiet authority. She knew the pilot's earlier outburst had not been a mere lapse in professionalism. It had been deliberate, meant to assert power over her, and she would not allow it to go unchecked. She glanced toward the cockpit again, careful not to make it obvious. The pilot was visible through the small window, adjusting his controls and speaking quietly with the co-pilot. His movements were more deliberate now, as if he were trying to regain composure, but she could see the subtle signs of stress, tightening around the eyes the way his shoulders shifted uneasily. That small crack in his demeanor was all she needed to confirm what she already knew. He had underestimated her, and he was realizing it too late. Around her, passengers were beginning to notice the tension. Some whispered to each other quietly, casting glances toward the front of the plane. A young woman a few rows ahead adjusted her headphones nervously. An older man kept shifting in his seat, his eyes flicking back and forth between the cockpit and the woman. No one said anything aloud, but the energy in the cabin had changed. People could feel that something was wrong, that there had been an unfair act, and that someone was quietly standing up to it. The flight attendants continued their routine, moving efficiently up and down the aisles. The woman appreciated their professionalism, but she also knew she needed to take careful action herself. She did not want to escalate unnecessarily, but she could not simply let the incident go unrecorded. She had learned long ago that documentation was critical. Facts, details, and calm observation carried far more weight than shouting or displaying anger. She began to make quiet notes on her phone. Every detail mattered: the time, the words, the gestures. She kept the record factual, objective, and concise, ensuring that there could be no dispute later. She did not need to document her own emotions. She only needed the actions of the pilot and the response of the crew. The act of recording these facts gave her a sense of control, a small reassurance that she was preparing for what needed to come next. Then the pilot spoke again, this time louder, projecting his voice into the cabin. He made a sarcastic remark, clearly aimed at her, about her asking too many questions. The words carried a sting of condescension, meant to belittle her in front of the passengers. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent, but she did not flinch. She kept her gaze steady, her tone calm but firm as she addressed the flight attendant beside her. She requested politely that the crew follow the correct protocol, that they note the incident and report it after landing. Her calmness contrasted sharply with the pilot's aggression, and passengers were beginning to notice the difference. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse or confront him directly. She allowed her composure to speak for her. In situations like this, she had learned authority was far more effective when it was quiet, deliberate, and unshakable. Some passengers began to take subtle actions. A young man in the row ahead picked up his phone as if he might record the situation. Another woman glanced nervously toward the aisle, and then returned to her own seat, watching quietly. The cabin was no longer merely a group of travelers. It had become a space where an imbalance of power was being silently observed. The woman's presence had shifted the dynamics entirely. Minutes passed, and the pilot's attempts to assert control became less frequent. He muttered under his breath, occasionally adjusting controls and speaking to the co-pilot, but there was a noticeable hesitation now. He was aware, even subconsciously, that any overt aggression would be witnessed and recorded. The subtle tension in his posture suggested that he understood he could not behave as he had before without consequence. The woman allowed herself a small breath, centering her thoughts. She had handled confrontations before where assumptions had been made about her abilities or her authority. In every situation, the key had been patience, observation, and strategic action. She understood that the current scenario was delicate. She was confined in a small space with someone who had already shown aggression. She needed to be precise, calm, and deliberate in her next steps. She shifted slightly in her seat, subtly opening her notebook while keeping her tablet active. She recorded small details about the interaction, the timing, the gestures, the words. She kept it objective, factual, and concise. This quiet act of preparation was empowering. She was not reacting emotionally. She was preparing strategically. She was reclaiming control in a situation where someone had attempted to intimidate her. Then, almost as if testing her, the pilot made another motion. It was small, deliberate, and meant to provoke. A hand brushing near her seat, a glance that carried the weight of intimidation. She did not react. She simply adjusted her posture, maintaining the same calm, controlled presence she had held since boarding. Passengers continued to notice, whispers rising quietly among them. The pilot's aggression was losing power because she refused to give it weight. Her unshakable calm had become the most powerful force in the cabin. The flight attendants, sensing the escalating tension, moved closer to observe without intervening immediately. They respected the woman's quiet authority and recognized that she was handling the situation with clarity and composure. Their attention also served as a subtle reminder to the pilot that the cabin was being watched, that his actions could not be dismissed or ignored. A few passengers, emboldened by the woman's quiet stance, began to whisper softly among themselves. One asked if she was okay, and she responded with a small, reassuring smile. It was enough to convey that she was fine, that she was in control without creating unnecessary attention or drama. Her calmness inspired a sense of quiet solidarity among those around her. As the flight continued, she carefully considered her next steps. She knew that the moment to fully assert accountability had not yet arrived. The pilot's behavior had been documented, witnessed, and noted. The crew was aware. The passengers had seen enough to recognize wrongdoing, and she had maintained complete control over her own response. Now she needed to prepare for what would come when the plane landed, when she could ensure proper action without escalating conflict unnecessarily. She returned to her tablet, focusing on her work, but her mind remained alert. Every movement, every gesture, every subtle sign of tension in the cabin was being noted. She understood that control was not about aggression or confrontation. It was about awareness, preparation, and calm authority. In that moment, she was both observer and strategist, quietly guiding the situation toward the outcome she knew was just and necessary. Passengers continued to glance at her, sensing the strength she radiated without needing to assert it loudly. Her presence alone had changed the dynamics in the cabin. The pilot, aware now that his assumptions were wrong, became increasingly tentative. The subtle shifts in his posture, the hesitation in his movements, were clear signs that he understood he had underestimated her. And that understanding only reinforced her calm authority. Several minutes passed, and the plane moved steadily through the sky. The woman continued her quiet work, keeping a detailed mental and written record of events. She had handled confrontations before, often in situations far more chaotic or public than this. But this moment required more than just composure. It required precision, careful observation, and the ability to project authority without aggression. She had mastered these skills over years of experience, and now they were serving her perfectly. At one point, a flight attendant approached quietly, offering a small nod of reassurance. The gesture was subtle but meaningful. It confirmed what the woman already knew. She was not alone in observing the situation, and her authority, though unspoken, was recognized by those around her. That quiet support was enough to maintain her sense of control. The pilot's subtle attempts at provocation began to fade. He no longer leaned aggressively or muttered under his breath as loudly. He seemed aware now that any further attempt to assert dominance could be documented and reported, and the risk outweighed whatever satisfaction he might have gained from intimidation. The cabin was calm, though the tension lingered, an invisible thread connecting everyone who had witnessed the earlier incident. The woman took a deep breath, centering herself again. She knew that the flight was not yet over, and that the pilot might attempt one final display of aggression. She remained vigilant, focused, and prepared. Her quiet authority had already shifted the balance of power, but she understood that true resolution would come only when the plane landed and proper procedures were in place. She glanced briefly at the passengers nearby. Some were clearly impressed by her composure. Others were relieved to see someone standing firmly against inappropriate behavior. No one spoke aloud, but the shared awareness in the cabin created a subtle sense of community. People were recognizing that standing against disrespect and injustice could be done with dignity, clarity, and calm, without shouting or confrontation. As the plane continued its journey, she returned. The plane began its descent, and the cabin lights were brightened slightly to prepare passengers for landing. The hum of the engines shifted as the pilots adjusted for the approach. The passengers, sensing the nearing end of the flight, began gathering their belongings and preparing for the landing procedures. There was a sense of relief in the air, though a quiet tension still lingered. As everyone remembered the subtle but clear confrontation that had occurred earlier, the woman remained calm, seated upright and composed. She had managed the situation with quiet authority for the entire flight, but she knew that the final step, ensuring accountability, was about to come. The pilot seated at the front could be seen through the small cockpit window. His posture was tense, his gestures controlled but strained. He was no longer moving with the arrogance or impatience he had displayed earlier. The shift in his demeanor was noticeable, a sign that he understood the weight of the situation he had created. She adjusted her bag and took a moment to organize her notes. Every detail from the flight was important: the gestures, the words, the timing. She had kept careful factual records and was prepared to present them clearly and professionally. It was not a matter of revenge or confrontation. It was a matter of ensuring that misconduct was addressed properly and that the disrespect she had endured would not be ignored. She had faced challenges before, but few were as direct and immediate as this. The flight attendants moved about the cabin, finishing their final checks. They were attentive and professional, but it was clear they were also aware of the tension that remained. They glanced discreetly at the woman, recognizing her calm authority. It was a subtle acknowledgement of her presence and control, and it reinforced the power dynamic that had quietly shifted during the flight. The pilot, aware now of the attention and awareness around him, remained in his seat, tense but silent. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, the passengers began to prepare to disembark. There was an undercurrent of curiosity and anticipation in the cabin. Some passengers glanced at her, sensing that she had been central to the earlier events. Others whispered quietly, discussing what had happened without fully knowing the details. The woman remained composed, standing only when the seatbelt sign allowed and moving with calm purpose toward the front of the plane. The moment had arrived. She approached the flight attendant nearest to the cockpit and spoke quietly but firmly. She requested that the pilot be questioned immediately and that a full report of the incident be prepared. Her calm, professional tone left no room for misunderstanding. The flight attendants nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation, and began the process of notifying airline officials. The passengers watched with quiet interest as the scene unfolded. Some exchanged glances, unsure of what would happen next. Others seemed reassured by her composure, sensing that someone was handling the situation with authority and clarity. The air was filled with a sense of anticipation, as though everyone understood that the events of the flight had created a turning point, a moment that demanded acknowledgement and action. At that moment, she made her identity known. She removed her jacket and, with calm authority, addressed the nearest crew member. She explained clearly and professionally that she was the police chief of the city, and that the earlier behavior by the pilot had been inappropriate and unprofessional. The words had an immediate effect. The flight attendants, already respectful of her presence, now understood fully the weight of her authority. The passengers' reactions ranged from shock to admiration. The pilot, who had assumed she was just another passenger, froze in place, his earlier arrogance completely dissolved. Her calm, confident explanation left no room for denial. She recounted the incident, highlighting the pilot's aggressive gestures and inappropriate remarks. She did not shout or make accusations. She simply presented the facts, clear and concise, as they had occurred. The crew listened attentively, taking notes and preparing to follow the necessary procedures. The passengers witnessing this revelation began to whisper among themselves, some expressing admiration for her composure and professionalism. The pilot attempted to speak, to explain, or perhaps to defend himself. But the weight of the situation and the clear authority of the woman left him unable to continue. His earlier aggression and assumptions had been dismantled quietly but effectively, without confrontation, without anger, and without drama. The entire cabin could sense the shift. What had begun as a tense, uncomfortable flight had now transformed into a moment of justice, subtle yet undeniable. Airline officials were contacted and arrived quickly after the plane reached the gate. The woman calmly presented her account of the incident, along with the notes she had meticulously recorded throughout the flight. Witnesses, including attentive passengers and the flight attendants, confirmed her version of events. The professionalism she displayed left no doubt in the minds of those present that the pilot had acted inappropriately, and that accountability was required. The passengers remained nearby, watching as the situation was addressed. Some quietly expressed their respect and admiration, acknowledging the courage it took to handle such an incident with calm authority. Others whispered to their neighbors, noting how remarkable it was to see someone navigate aggression and prejudice with such poise. The woman, standing quietly yet firmly, had transformed what could have been a chaotic confrontation into a controlled, accountable resolution. The pilot was escorted to a private area for questioning, still visibly shaken. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by tension and awareness of the consequences he now faced. The airline officials treated the situation seriously, acknowledging the severity of his behavior and the professional standing of the woman who had reported it. The contrast between her calm authority and his faltering presence was stark and undeniable. The woman took a moment to speak with the flight attendants, offering thanks for their professionalism and attention. She emphasized the importance of following proper procedures, ensuring that the incident would be handled appropriately. Her words were measured, professional, and clear, reinforcing the authority she carried not through aggression but through clarity, composure, and factual presentation. Passengers began to leave the plane in an orderly fashion, but many paused to observe, some even quietly expressing admiration or gratitude. They had witnessed a powerful demonstration of composure, authority, and justice. The tension that had defined much of the flight was replaced by a quiet respect for the woman's actions and the clarity with which she had addressed the situation. Once off the plane, she was met by airline officials who thanked her for handling the situation professionally and for providing detailed documentation. They assured her that the pilot would face the appropriate consequences and that the incident would be addressed according to company policy. She listened attentively, confirming that all steps would be taken to ensure accountability and fairness. The woman did not allow herself to become distracted by the attention of passengers or officials. Her focus remained on ensuring that the necessary actions were taken to prevent such behavior in the future. She had handled the flight with calm authority, and now she was ensuring that the resolution matched the professionalism and dignity she had maintained throughout. News of the incident quickly spread among those who had witnessed it, some sharing their experiences quietly with friends and family. Passengers recounted how the woman had maintained composure, addressed aggression with clarity, and revealed her professional authority in a way that was both commanding and respectful. The story, even in its initial retelling, highlighted the importance of calm, deliberate action and the impact of standing firmly against inappropriate behavior. The pilot, meanwhile, was formally questioned and informed that he would face immediate suspension pending investigation. The airline acknowledged the seriousness of the incident, particularly given the professional standing of the woman who had been wronged. His earlier attempts at aggression and intimidation had not gone unnoticed, and the formal process now ensured that accountability would follow. Throughout the aftermath, the woman remained composed, professional, and focused. She spoke calmly with airline officials, provided her detailed notes, and ensured that every aspect of the incident was properly documented. She did not seek revenge or public attention. Her goal was accountability and the clear resolution of misconduct. Her demeanor throughout reinforced the power of calm authority, professionalism, and dignity in situations where others seek to provoke or intimidate. Passengers continued to share quiet remarks of admiration as they left the airport. Some spoke of how impressed they were with her calm handling of the situation. Others expressed gratitude for demonstrating a way to address conflict without escalating it. Even those who had not been directly involved understood that what they had witnessed was a rare example of quiet authority and effective action. By the time she left the airport, the situation had been fully addressed. The pilot had been confronted with his actions, airline officials were taking appropriate measures, and the passengers had witnessed a clear demonstration of professional authority. The woman's calm, methodical approach had ensured that the situation was resolved effectively,